Welcome to After the Leap. I'm your host, Hayden Adams. And on this podcast, I want to explore with business owners the feeling they got after the leap of leaving the corporate world, of changing careers, of making a change and saying yes to intuition, spirit, and guidance. For my first interview, I wanted to sit down with my own business coach, Linda Anderson, who I've had the pleasure working with for over 15 years. She's really helped guide me in a lot of ways, but primarily to keep me focused on what I like to do. And now I'm venturing into this crazy world of podcasting, and I thought there'd be no person better than who I'd want to interview first than Linda Anderson of Prosperity Circles. Yeah, this is the very first podcast of, I'm calling it now After the Leap, where I want to talk to business owners who have really gone out on their own and become solopreneurs, small business owners, and have left the corporate environment. And in full disclosure, I have worked with Linda for 15 years now?
Yes.
So I do know a bit of her story, but I still want to sit down with her because she has a great background in business as a business coach and also a spiritual business coach. And I want to kind of ask her some questions about how she made the leap from the corporate world to being her own boss and what it felt like to leave. What was the emotional response of like that fear of releasing, and then how did it feel after you've leapt from that corporate world? So first, just want to know kind of about you and where'd you come from and how'd you get started, and then the corporate world would then transfer to the self-employment world.
All right. Well, I grew up on a farm in South Dakota and went to a one-room schoolhouse, and then went from having one classmate to having a class of 300. So that was kind of a leap all by itself.
It's almost like leap number one.
Right. And so then ended up my freshman through junior year of college, I went to Augsburg College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And then I got married and moved to Minneapolis, and I finished up at I can say this, Augsburg College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Cool. So that was probably leap number 2. And once I graduated, I worked in corporate for about 10 years. And there was a point in working in corporate where I was getting my MBA. I was halfway through an MBA program, and I was working 60, 80 hours a week.
That's a lot.
Going through a divorce, and I was a wreck. There were many days I ended up in the bathroom in tears, and kept looking for another job, but nothing, was coming through. And intuitively, I knew I wanted to move towards what I wanted rather than away from what I didn't want. And so at some point along the way, my mentor said, get your MBA, get as fast as you can from the best place you can. And I'd had a dream of living and working in Europe. And there was one day at work that I was flipping through The Economist and saw an ad for this program in Switzerland. 9-month program, taught in English, people from 20 different countries or so. And I intuitively knew that was the program for me. If I couldn't live and work in Europe, the next best thing was to go to school there. And so I applied immediately, and maybe a few months later, I still hadn't heard that I had been accepted, but I put my house on the market.
Wow. That's a big leap of faith in that way too, that this is going to work out.
Yeah, I wasn't aware at the time of my intuition, but, in years since, my intuition played a major role in that.
And after that, you got accepted and you went to Switzerland.
Yes, I did get accepted and ended up quitting my job, selling my house, selling my car, and it was very interesting, though, because a few weeks before I left for Europe, by that time I had a place to live across the border from Geneva in France. And a couple of weeks before I left for Europe, I took my first weekend meditation workshop. And I didn't know how significant it was at the time, but in that workshop, I got that my calling is to help people maximize their potential. And I also learned a meditation practice that really put in motion what is now a 30-year and counting meditation practice.
Wow. And I'm also curious, like after you kind of the intuition, once you got to Switzerland and you actually were there, what was the feeling like? Because it's the emotion of before, but what is it like afterwards when you actually got into class or you got settled in your apartment? What was there any fear? Was there any hesitation? Did you feel like you were in the right spot? Did you feel like you made the biggest change of your life? What was the emotional attachment to actually making that leap and actually putting your feet down on Switzerland's terra firma?
It was actually really exciting. I don't remember feeling scared or having second thoughts. It was exciting to meet people from all over the world. It was a class of 49 and 2 women. So that was an interesting adjustment.
Mm-hmm. And then after you got your MBA, did you go into the corporate world again? Did you go back into it, or where did you go after that? So after you've taken this first leap and it felt correct, what was the result of getting your MBA? What was the next steps upon completion?
I'll answer that in a moment, but I actually wrote my master's thesis on the impact of self-esteem and self-awareness on employees' performance in the workplace. And I'm dating myself, but this is the mid 80s, and there wasn't a heck of a lot written about self-esteem. But somehow I must have known intuitively that being willing to work 60 to 80 hours a week had something to do with low self-esteem.
I could imagine if you don't give yourself any bit of time to just even recuperate and you're just working 24/7, in this case 60 hours a week, it's going to create burnout.
Absolutely. So as the program progressed, it was probably in the spring that I really made a list of the kind of work that I wanted to be doing. And I remember looking at the list and saying, this is some weird job. It's not anything that I had ever heard of. But it was an integration. By that point, I had the business and financial background and the emotional, the self-esteem piece. And so it's kind of holding those three at that point. It's like, how are these going to weave together? And it wasn't evident at first, but I just kept holding that. And as I was working on my master's thesis, my supervisor had no idea what I was talking about. And I went to a conference in France, and there was a person who spoke. He was the HR director for IBM Zurich. And he was talking about bringing managers, directors, senior management to a chalet for the weekend to help them figure out where they wanted to go with their work life and their life, because they were showing signs of burnout. And so he was the first person who I met or had heard of who was kind of talking my language. And so was up there like a shot after he finished speaking. And, we continued to have conversations really through the rest of the program. And he said, whatever you do when you go back to the United States, go check out this leadership development kind of program in Stillwater, Oklahoma. is ropes course, fire walking, I forget what, some kind of games. And
And this was the vice president of IBM.
he was HR director.
He was the HR director assigned to do a ropes course in Oklahoma.
Right. Right. Because
In
he
Zurich.
had brought his executive team there and had been very impressed. So here I am going from Geneva, Switzerland to Stillwater, Oklahoma.
Just a little south of South Dakota.
And then ultimately ended up taking a job there for about a year. So, it was a very circuitous route, once the MBA program was over, going to Oklahoma. And then there was a point where, again, intuitively, I knew, I was like, go west. And ended up in Northern California.
Yeah, we are sitting in Northern California, Marin County, so we are about as far west you can go in the Pacific before you actually hit the Pacific. And the question I'm also curious about is that the intuitive go west, was there a job waiting for you in California? What was there in California that was calling you aside from pure the geographical location of California?
My mother lived in LA at that time, and my brother lived in Oakland. And so I went to see my mother, and it's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I went to LA, no, that's not right. Then I went to San Diego, no, that doesn't feel right. And then came up to Northern California, and it felt right. And so ended up moving to Oakland, and I've been here ever since.
And did you actually get a corporate job when you moved here, or was this the start of like the freelance entrepreneurial route?
It was the beginning of the freelance route. I started my business probably about a year after I got here, and I wasn't sure what kind of business to start, but my again, another mentor said, you're analytical. I think you'd be good at setting up accounting systems. And so I hadn't ever set up an accounting system, but I thought, okay, I can do this, and talked to my CPA about it. And, within a couple of days, he referred my first client, who ended up being a client for, probably almost 20 years.
Oh my gosh.
And I did that kind of work, accounting setup, cash flow management, for about 12, 13 years.
What would you say would be like the hardest thing in that first year? Because you changed your location again, which is already difficult for some people to actually do, and to relocate, let alone knowing your brother in Oakland. But that first year of like going, okay, I'm going to make it on my own. What was the challenges? What was the part that we all want to be successful to overcome the stumbling blocks of knowing you can do this? Was there a point where you're almost like, oh my God, I can't do this? Or was there a point where you said, I can do this, dug my heels in and making it work? Because you're going out on your own from scratch with a CPA.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I started doing, more of the financially related work, I don't remember being scared about doing that or being reluctant to market myself. It was actually pretty easy to market myself. But the problem with that path was that it wasn't really aligned with who I am and why I'm here. And what the difficult passage was when I came to kind of a crossroads where what I really wanted to be doing was work more directly with people in helping them express their true potential. And it was and still is more of a soul work. And what I find in working with clients, and what I found in my own life is that when you're doing something that's really a calling or soul work, there's this feeling of nakedness and being extremely vulnerable. So it was that stage where I was really, really starting to put my soul's work out there, but my self-esteem hadn't really gotten to a level where where I had the soul strength to put it out. So I kind of halfway joke about it, but it wasn't funny. I was sort of marketing and hiding. I was marketing with my cloaking device on.
I mean, when you're out there by yourself and you're also marketing yourself, it's very personable because you are the sole representation of a one-man band. Where in other respects, other companies, you're one person of 50, 100, 200, 2,000 people. And to complicate things, to bare your soul through one-on-one consulting and coaching isn't easy, where you have to get to that level where you're comfortable and they have to be comfortable with you.
Right. And the piece that was particularly vulnerable, by that point, I had been introduced to spirituality as I now know it. That was one of the gifts of my year in Oklahoma, is really coming to recognize God within, spirit within, really coming to understand more directly my intuition. And so here I am, coming from a mainstream background in business and finance, working in the financial field and bringing spirituality to that work. That was the piece, that was really, really difficult and vulnerable for me. Because I had so many coaches and consultants say, oh, you can't talk about that. You can't talk about the spiritual.
And yet you do that. I mean, your logo even has a heart in it.
Right. It still is a journey, I would say, to really put it out front and center, the spiritual aspect. And it's not because I have doubts about the power, but it can be misinterpreted so easily. People, stuff comes up around, the word God or religion it's nothing to do with organized religion. It's really about learning to turn within and come to trust your deepest knowing.
And I would probably follow up with that by saying that there's an unofficial stigma of bringing up spirituality, especially in the business world, where it's the famous, when you go networking, that you basically don't talk about religion and politics, the two things you don't do, and yet you're touching one of those two in your core principles of your business.
Right. So over the years, the 4 principles that I've come to really base my work on, and again, this came from intuition. Those principles center around focus, faith, footwork, and finances. And so what's important about focus is that what you're focusing on is spiritually aligned, so that where you're headed with your life, where you're headed with your business, your calling, your business mission, that in all those ways, by turning within for the answers, they're a whole lot more likely to be congruent and authentic and aligned, and you're going to be a whole lot happier.
It's really where I agree with Linda wholeheartedly, where if you're focused on what you want, you're going to get it. And if you're focused on what you don't want, you're going to get that. Where it's one thing to say, I don't want something, but it's not to say, I want something. And it's also putting that statement that the faith is part of that mission statement, is that this is part of who I am. And that would definitely be one of those leaps where you're going, okay, here we go. and yet it's worked successfully in your business practices.
Right. And, with the faith element, what I see most gets in people's way around faith or confidence is self-esteem.
Goes almost full circle in a way.
Right. And so really working with, in my work with my clients, oftentimes I see that they've gotten so focused on the business, so focused on making money that they've left themselves out of the picture. And so they're the last to get paid. They're the last to take a vacation. They're working, and it ultimately sets up a downward spiral.
And there's that balance you have to have, and that's what I know from working with you for 15 years, that I've had to keep that balance. And that's pretty much where I was kind of going that full circle of this interview, was talking to you, going basically how to prevent that. And there's that faith aspect that we almost have to have that keeps you from burning out.
Right, because if you're taking care of yourself along the way, in very basic levels, taking time for R&R and sleep and diet, exercise, and also boundaries. Speaking up, standing up for yourself can be one of the hardest things for a lot of the people I work with. And yet, doing so is one of the central things that really bolsters your self-esteem. And so if where you're headed in your life and business is aligned with who you are, what's important, what you value, if you're doing the thing, if you've clarified the things that really support your health and well-being, then the footwork becomes obvious.
And that's a good point. I mean, especially as the coaching side, it's not just the business coaching, but as you were saying, it's your entire life around the coaching part. The business is an aspect, but if you're not putting your personal life in addition to your business life, then there's no way that this work-life balance is ever going to work.
Right. So even though I learned the business and financial aspects very early on, it was really my own personal journey where I came to understand the importance and the power of the self-esteem piece, as well as the spiritual element. And so you might say, well, how does this relate to the finances? And what I find happens a lot is, we're conditioned, I think, societally to view success or prosperity in financial terms. And so with that as the goal, the focus, financial success being the goal or the focus, that drives how we spend our time. And then the tendency is for our self-esteem to become tied to our work, how much money we make, it becomes tied to things outside of ourselves. And then we lose track of what's most important.
And that kind of goes back to the mission of your business, is to
Right.
help people have that balance in there. And speaking of that, tell us about your business. So where can we find out more information about you?
So my business is called Prosperity Circles, and my website is surpriseprosperitycircles.com. And the focus of my business is really helping business owners make a difference, make a profit, and at the same time have a life.
Which can be a difficult strategy to achieve, especially if you are a solopreneur or a small business owner where you feel that your business is your life. And if you're listening to this, by all means, feel free to contact Linda. Do you work with people outside of California?
I do. I really can work with people all over the world, providing they speak English.
And there's enough of a time span where you're not sleeping while they're awake and vice versa kind of thing. Linda, thank you for joining us on this first first podcast, my first mistake after like 20 minutes. I thought I was doing so good here, but I very much appreciate you coming on this program. And once again, if you're curious, you can contact Linda at prosperitycircles.com. And thank you once again, Linda, for being here.
Thank you, Hayden.